You know, for several years now, we have had bizarre weather, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. Now, many people will simply explain it as global warming or climate change. However, if we go back to the story of Noah, there was a universal flood 4,200 years ago. Back in the time of Elijah, there was a 7-year drought. Also, there was a 3.5-year drought in the time of Elijah. And we can go through scripture and show you and historical records that there have been bizarre weather patterns for quite some time. However, in the United States, when studying our weather patterns, especially not earthquakes or anything of that nature, but simply the weather, we always know that in the spring months there will be tornadoes with hail and damaging winds and rain. And usually in the summer and into the early fall, there will be possibility of large hurricanes. And this has been going on for quite some time. However, I do want to show you something I think you're going to find interesting. And I want you to watch all of this because I'm going to give you a verse from the Lamsa Aramaic translation of the New Testament that's mind-boggling. And most people have never heard it. Now, real quick. Weather patterns are believed by most people to either be, number one, simply natural patterns that are recurring. Number two, all created and caused by God himself, who is the creator. Or at times, number three, demonic in nature. Here's what's odd. If you have a neighborhood and there's a really bad person that lives there, and let's say a storm comes through and their house is destroyed, people will say, well, I tell you what, the Lord really got him back. That was God's judgment. But if you took the same neighborhood and the bad guy's house existed and remained after a storm and someone who was very good or godly, their home was destroyed, then the same people would say, Satan really attacked them, didn't he? So honestly, it can be very confusing as to what's this all about when it gets bizarre, when it gets destructive, when it gets really weird. So just to show you in the Bible, we do know that God does control things. According to Elijah, he said, there'll be no rain these years according to my word. And that was a judgment upon Israel for Ahab's sins. We also know by reading scripture that in the book of Job, Satan himself created a wind that literally destroyed the home of Job's children, and 10 of them died in the tragedy. We also know that lightning came from the sky and destroyed literally thousands of Job's animals. And if you read Job chapter 1, it was Satan that did this. In the book of Revelation chapter 12, we read that Satan spews water out of his mouth to destroy the man-child who is represented in that chapter symbolically by the Jewish people or the nation of Israel. So without going into detail, we could go, for example, to the story of Jesus in the boat and how a great storm hit. And that Greek word in the gospel there is seismos. It's where we get the word, the root for the word seismograph from. It was an underwater earthquake that was creating waves covering the ship, almost causing the boat to sink. Bottom line is simply this. Weather can be simply natural patterns. Weather can be at times judgment from the Lord. But weather at other times can also be a satanic attack against an area or against someone. Because Satan is called in Ephesians 2:2, the prince of the power of the air. So sometimes it just takes discernment to figure out what it's all about. I would just simply say that the majority of times I think it's natural phenomena. I think there is, I don't know about global warming, but I think the climate has changes that have taken place, but it's actually been taking place for a long time and not just recently. But here's the verse I want to give you, and I really did this whole teaching to tell you about this. I know that over the past couple of years, especially in the 90s, there was a lot of talk about everything is getting warmer and warmer and warmer, and the snow has gone away, the polar caps are going to melt. Then all of a sudden, a few years after that came out and movies and books were written, we find out that things started getting colder and colder. And recently, out in the Midwest, there was think about this, record-breaking snow. In some areas, record-breaking cold. In Europe recently, about a year or two ago, record-breaking snow, ice, and cold. So what's happening? The Lamsa translation of the Bible was translated from the Aramaic verses. In other words, the New Testament written in the Aramaic. Now we know the New Testament was written in the Greek language, and when the King James was translated, they used the Masoretic text to translate the King James translation, but it was the Orthodox church that had the Lamsa Aramaic translation, or should I say the Aramaic translation of the Bible. In the Aramaic translation of the Bible, used by the Eastern Church in Luke 21:11, Jesus says there'll be earthquakes in different places and famines and pestilences and great and fearful signs from heaven. In the Aramaic version, which is very, very old, by the way, it is also said that Christ said this. So let me give you the entire quote. There will be earthquakes in different places and famines and plagues, and there will be alarming signs, and great signs will appear from heaven, and the winters shall be severe. And the winters shall be severe. And I do believe that literally is something that was stated, that was recorded there in the Aramaic translation and was handed down. That is a part of this particular, again, most of you never heard of that translation. I've studied and heard of it because it is the Aramaic translation of the Eastern Church. And of course, the Masoretic text, I don't want to get into all the Bible study, it's what the King James was translated from. And that comes actually from the Latin translation and St. Jerome and all these different types of historical things that we could get into. My point is simply this. I do believe that the weather is a sign. And I believe that when the weather begins to become the way that it is now, and we begin to see such destruction, that we can take that as a sign of what we call birth pains in the heavens. And also earthquakes and tsunamis and things of this nature are the spiritual birth pains happening on the earth. Or we could sum it up this way, birth pains of the Messiah. So I want to encourage you today that if you're someone that doesn't really study scripture, doesn't study biblical history, or doesn't study prophecy, please start doing so. You might be surprised and shocked what you will find out and how true the scripture really is, especially as it relates to events that are going to happen. Listen to me very carefully. Usually at the end of each video, we pull an advertisement that was on a manifest telecast